marketing leaders die like flies sometimes. You have to start with figuring out who are we, what do we do, and why should anyone care? Right. So my first slide in the first board meeting ever, 2 weeks after I joined, said, marketing is not set up for success. I might be wrong, in some areas, I'm probably going to be wrong. But based on what I've seen, here's where we lack certain capabilities. I literally had a table and then traffic lights, red, yellow, green, and then here's the next step. 3 months later, I came back to the board meeting and I had a second column with traffic lights, and some of the stuff that was red was now orange or green, and some of the stuff was gray because I said, listen, this is a problem, but it's not the highest priority.
Welcome back to Horizons podcast, where I convince marketing leaders to spill their secrets for the rest of us. I'm your host, Nate Desmond, and today I'm sitting down with Thomas Palm. Thomas and I both were at Google's London office at the same time for a few years. And something I noticed about him is he has a unique superpower. Very few people are good at brand and good at growth, but Thomas has this unique ability to build lasting legacies while still keeping sight of ROI realities. So I'm excited to get into that, as well as some of the work he's done at a variety of startups afterwards. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Nate. I'm super excited for the conversation.
Same. I'd love to start with Google. You were there at Google as the CMO of Capital G, which is Google's investment arm, and you were the person who sort of put it on the map. You were also working on Google Assistant in our Europe and Middle East region, and now you're at a B2B company that's selling sustainability solutions. These are all fairly different organizations, more traditional tech, VC, B2B startup. How do you change your marketing approach depending on the organization?
That's a very good question. I think there's some fundamentals that never change. Right. And some people on your podcast have talked about that as well. The balance between the why and the what. Right. And then the difference often lies in the how. So I think there's the work that needs to be done around strategy and kind of foundations, and not just brand strategy, just like company strategy. Why are we here? At Google, we used to describe marketing as understanding the magic, understanding the user, and connecting the two, right? Which to this day, I think is a great lens through which to look at this wide field of marketing, right? Andy Byrne, the founder of Creative Lab, always used to, when asked to describe the CMO job, said, well, if you don't deliver the numbers, you get fired. But if your CEO's partner doesn't like the TV spot, you also get fired, right? So it's just really almost an impossible job to get right, which is one of the reasons why it is the highest turnover executive function in the C-suite, right? So marketing leaders die like flies. Sometimes it's, and sometimes to their own fault. But I think there's often a mismatch in the alignment of what maybe a company leader or CEO founder expects, and then what kind of profile of marketeer he brings in, right? But that's a tangent we can jump back on afterwards to get back to your question. I think you have to start with figuring out, like, who are we? What do we do? And why should anyone care? Right. And there's different ways to pose those questions. Again, as we said, one is like, what is the magic, right? Understanding not the features, but what does it actually do, and understanding the user and the Google context and the B2B context. You'd speak of buying personas or your buying center. And but at the end of the question is always the same, right? You have to start with that. What do we do that is useful? Why would anyone care about it? And then you can think about how we bring it to the market. And even that usually starts with what we would call product marketing. I think Google is rightfully famous for the quality of its product marketing. And most founders in a startup context would start by asking for a growth marketeer or someone, who can do performance marketing before growth became cool, right? So they just want to get users. But I think my advice is always to start with product marketing, because you have to figure that out first, right? So understand the needs of your user, jobs to be done, whatever framework you use, right? Understand how your product can fulfill those, and then think about how you talk about it, right? Usually the product is quite complex, or at least the way the product people talk about it is quite complex. So a key job is simplification, right? Which is something that the Americans are really good at, right? Europeans and especially Germans maybe not as good. I remember even in university, even if our classes were in German, we would always get the English textbook because it was so much easier to understand, right? There seems to be kind of a notion in German that if it's not complex, it's not academic. And that I feel that has kind of continued into some companies where they're like, no, 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 like we can't simplify it that much. I'm like, no, no, you should, right? And thinking about hierarchy of messaging. So, sometimes or often you see these companies or you go to a homepage and it just screams at you everything they do, everything they can do, right? This is like going on a date and saying hello, and then the person on the other side of the table telling you their entire life story, right? That's not a nice date. That's not a nice experience for you, right? You have to think about at what message is important, at what touch point, at what stage of the funnel, right? And that is all universal, whether you're in a big company, in a small company, in a B2B or in a B2C setting. And I just think then the tactics on how you what channels you use to get in, where do you meet your user to say it, or your buyers, as simply as that, I think is what may change.
Love that. There's so much to dig into there. I want to start with simplicity. So your current company, your CMO at iPoint, which is
Yes.
sustainability solutions. That
And
sounds to
compliance.
anyone in a non B2B area like a fairly complex space. How do you describe that simply to your target audience?
Well, we could speak hours about this because that has literally been one of the first jobs since I came in. So iPoint has been around for 20 years. It's one of those classic German hidden champions, a visionary founder many years ago who had an idea and an insight into what the market might need and building around that. And then at some point in the journey, bringing in a private equity investor for the next phase of scale, who then in turn brought on a new management team and brought on me ultimately as the last piece of the C-suite, so to say, right? So, I mean, maybe very briefly, some context on iPoint. So, iPoint, we say we exist to put power in the hands of people who are dedicated to advancing a safer and more sustainable future. So, that's our purpose. That's our mission, right? What does it mean? So, if you make a product, you have an impact. It's unavoidable, right? You can manage that impact in order to try to make it a positive one, or if it's inevitably a negative one, reduce the negative impact, right? And that is really impact for us is what unites these two worlds of compliance and sustainability, right? Because as a user, you don't really it doesn't really matter for you, right? Your kind of needs and expectations of something you buy is the same, right? So in the compliance part, it might be that, you pay fast forever chemicals, right? They're BPA, they're in everyone knows about those, right? But there's tons of others that people don't know about probably, right? There's an area called responsible minerals, which used to be conflict minerals, right? Anything that has electronics likely has a chip. That chip has gold and other materials on it, right? Minerals on it. How are they sourced? Do they come from places where you kind of have unintended consequences, from child labor to financing warlords that commit to other human rights abuses? So these are all compliance topics, right? Quite regulated, and regulation is not always bad, right? But I think in this case, it's a good one. And then there's, of course, the sustainability part, which is also impact, right? So from and not just on manufacturing a good, but kind of what we call cradle to grave, right? So from sourcing the materials to manufacturing something to then using it, reusing it, recycling it, and understanding that entire life cycle and acknowledging that up to 80% of the emissions, if you just look at carbon as one kind of environmental impact, up to 80% is in the supply chain, which is called scope 3 emissions, right? So for us, large part of our clients come from the automotive industry. If you have a BMW factory, BMW is one of our customers, right? In Germany, they most likely already use some portion of green energy. They have filters in their chimneys. They've probably done what they could in order to reduce the environmental impact, right? Otherwise, the neighbors would have complained a long time ago. But then the big unlocks are where do they source their steel, right? One is, of course, transportation, right? Does it come from Asia? Does it come from the Czech Republic? Is it German steel, right? That comes from next door. But even more impactful, probably, is it recycled steel, or is it at least a portion of recycled steel? So it's super complex, right? And why does all of this matter? Maybe just two more sentences just to wrap this up, this part. There's, of course, customer expectations, right? So when you buy a good, having lived 4 years in the US where a lot of these regulations don't exist, you can only buy organic food because otherwise you don't know if it will kill you or not, right? I mean, we just spoke about having kids, and I have many friends who would buy like European baby formula because they just feel the regulations are stricter and they have more confidence in that. So regulation is can be a bit of a dirty world because people associate it with bureaucracy and additional costs. But maybe a little European of me, but I'm quite happy that some of those exist to keep us safe. And we help people understand the impact and manage the impact on a material level. So this is our key differentiator. We do this bottom up. There's a ton of startups out there, especially in the sustainability space, who have a top-down view on this, who are like, they do the spend-based kind of, okay, you have use 1,000 tons of steel, okay, that is that much carbon, and now the CFO has a number they can report in the audit, but that doesn't help you manage it, right? You really have to understand, as I described, on a material level, what the impact and what the materials are used in order to manage it.
I love how you showed in that where you can bring a story alive. That if you tell the average person this is about compliance, that sounds maybe over my head a bit boring. But you tell the person this is about making sure warlords are not getting money from what you just bought at the grocery store. Suddenly, that's a lot more exciting. So I love that framing of how do you simply bring the magic out of what this product does, and also how that's different for each audience. So like warlords connects with me as a consumer, but as a business, the part that probably connects is more the like, oh, you can actually help me source my steel from a place that's closer to my company. It's better for the world. And in theory, it's probably better for me because I don't have to bring it from so far away. That's quite exciting. How do you see differences between, let's say, like Google and these startups that you've been at in how you message about marketing internally, how you convince your stakeholders what are the right things to do?
I think Google has been in an incredibly fortunate position that marketing had a very strong seat at the table, right? I mean, when I joined a million years ago in 2011, I think global marketing was 600 people. I think I was just number 650. All of Google had like 20,000 employees. Lorraine, as the CMO, reported to Nikesh, who was the chief business officer, who reported to Eric, right? But already then, I think Lorraine did a fantastic job of just demanding and earning that seat at the table, right? And then, of course, when Sundar became CEO, who used to be the Chrome product lead, and I think marketing played a huge part in making Chrome the successful browser it is today, especially in the beginning, right? This was a weird situation for Google because we were very used to being just the number one in a category, and all of a sudden we wanted to win in a category where people didn't even understand that category existed, right? Nobody knew what a browser was. When you had a PC, you clicked on that little Internet Explorer icon and you were online, right? You couldn't tell people Chrome was a better browser because they didn't know what a browser was, right? And I thought, based on that experience that Sundar had personally with marketing and what it could do, again, understanding the magic, understanding the user, connecting the two and helping advance his products, I think marketing at Google benefits from until this day. So that's the Google story. I think on the startup side, as I already said, and this is not, you have to start with yourself. I think it's part of our job as marketeers and especially as marketing leaders to understand expectations and to manage expectations, right? I had some of my bosses I had at Google, some very strong leaders who maybe were a little more direct, clearer in managing these expectations and just demanding an eye-level relationship, right? And I do the same to this day, which in the most respectful, humble way possible. My boss is my boss. In this case right now, he's the CEO. That's fine. But there's a reason I'm here, right? And it's very much a help me help you. Okay. So help me understand not what do you want from marketing, but help me understand the business need. What is our strategy? Where do you see gaps? Like, what are you struggling with? Are we struggling with retention? Are we struggling with pipeline? Are we struggling with product launches? Are we, whatever it is, right? And then I can use my experience in my toolkit in order to translate those business objectives into marketing objectives. We can align on those. We can define KPIs and measurement. I can manage your expectation that you're not going to see impact from a rebrand within a month or 3 months or 6 months, right? We can look at leading indicators, but, and then I'll come back to you and report regularly. But it's my job to define how I want to be measured as a marketeer. And if I don't do that, that often creates that misalignment, right? Where the marketing team and the marketing leader kill themselves working their butts off, and feel it's not seen, it's not appreciated, or at least not moving the levers that their management expects them to move.
And just going deeper on that, like you came in as CMO at Capital G, now you're CMO at iPoint. You did head of brand at Curated in between a high growth startup. What were your first 90 days like? And let's say like in iPoint, What do you do differently in your first 90 days versus what you maybe did at Capital G?
I think, I mean, there's so many literature out there I mean, literally books on called The First 90 Days. And I'm sure we've all read them. And some of it is applicable, some of it is not, right? I try not to wait 90 days to have an impact while saving myself from or resisting jumping to conclusions too early, right? So I think you have to parallel track it. The first thing is you have to really open the fire hose and immerse yourself and learn as much and as quickly as you can, right? And that is usually before. I mean, the trick is not to start on day one, but to start on day minus 14 or whatever, right? Like get the team to send you stuff, things you can consume, things you can read the website, case studies, whatever material there is, while you don't have an inbox and while you don't have a Teams or a Slack installed, use the time to prepare. That really helps, especially in something like iPoint, where just understanding what we do was incredibly complex and took me a while. You know, then once you start, I think conversations, like in both cases, iPoint is a company of like 180 people, right? So I've worked with my CEOs, like who should I meet when, and he's been brilliant at already setting up all these meetings for me long before I got there, right? And then be quite structured around that, right? Have a set of questions, let the others talk, ask the open-ended questions to very different people and see what comes back. And I think from that, and of course, I think especially at kind of my stage of my career in terms of tenure, I think you've had a few repetitions, so you have a hunch pretty quickly or an instinct, what might be working, what might not be working. And then I immediately look for quick wins, which might be as simple as move a button on the homepage, rewrite a headline, create a landing page, or something like that, where you're or jump on make some AdWords changes or so forth, where you're like, okay, like I don't know if it is gonna work, but what I do know is what you have right now is not gonna work because it doesn't meet any best practices and the numbers tell me it's not working. So why don't we try this? And maybe it's a quick win.
That's exciting. I want to go deeper in this area of brand. And you have a particularly unique experience that people may have heard of Google's Creative Lab. If they haven't, it's a fantastic thing to go look up. You spent 3 years on Creative Lab in London. What was that like? And what lessons can so called normal marketers like the rest of us take away from how Creative Lab operates?
So, I mean, those were up to this day the three most fun years of my career, I have to say. And also most intense. I was discussing with my wife the other day. We were kind of reflecting on a time in London. We were like, I don't even remember what did we have for dinner in London, because we cook a lot now, and now I live in Italy, and it's a big part of course, our life. And she was like, well, we didn't cook a lot because at least 3-4 days a week you weren't at home at night. You just ate in the office every night. And I was like, yeah, true. It was a really intense period. The Creative Lab, I think, and again, in a very unique Google way, Creative Lab is the only team at Google that doesn't have OKRs, that doesn't have, in internal team side where it's defined what they do purposefully, right? It's a group of the world's leading creatives, technologists, strategists, writers, filmmakers, very diverse creatives, and some people like me, just which we call team lead, right? So mixes of strategists and account managers, so to say, who kind of would lead business, would be like the business lead on projects. And our only mission was to remind the world why they love Google. So that's as defined as it was. It was led by Andy Burnett, who's someone who worked with Steve Jobs in the past and was brought in by, interestingly, David Lowy, the Capital G CEO and founder, who felt that he needed someone outside the Silicon Valley bubble to get marketing right, when he was at Google. And so from kind of, I think a lot of strategic product, like a lot of the Google I/O stuff is done by Creative Lab, a lot of product launches like Google Photos back in the days, these kind of things were done by Creative Lab. But also a lot of, especially in London, we had a lot of freedom to do kind of interesting explorations. We did use Google resources to do something awesome that only Google would do. Not necessarily expensive, but just kind of having the freedom to think in that way, which is not always given in corporate environments. When Chrome launched, we talked about it. There was an exhibition in the Science Museum in London called Web Lab, which for the first had a bunch of exhibitions that you could interact with physically when you were there or through your browser digitally, and millions of people did. Right when Google Cardboard and the first wave of kind of AR VR came up, we digitized all of Abbey Road Studios, and you could use your cardboard to experience, open Abbey Road Studios and tour it, like kind of, one of the most impactful music studios in the world, which doors are shut to most music lovers, right? And there you could get in. Or we did an exhibition at the Barbican, which was called DevArt, to kind of counter some of the fears people have towards technology and showcase that developers are kind of artists in their own right. They just use, instead of paint, they use code. So, and there was a couple of kind of installations from creative technologists, which we curated. So that was Google Creative Lab.
And it's interesting taking something like this the Abbey Road cardboard collaboration. It shows really well how you can bridge building a brand with something iconic, something that's very unique that, as you said, only Google could do. But then at the same time, it's also driving real growth of the product. People are downloading cardboard and they're using it on their phones and they're experiencing VR maybe for the first time. How do you come up with such a creative idea that is so outside of any normal box of like, oh, let me run a campaign or buy a billboard or do a TV? This is completely different. How do you even start bringing up creative ideas like this?
Yeah. And to be very clear, none of those ideas I mentioned or none of those projects were my ideas. Most of them I didn't even work on personally, but the team did those. But I think what you can learn, I think the key to success for a team like Creative Lab is to obviously have the right people, but also have the right setup. And the right setup in a big corporation usually means shielding them, right? So I don't know if you remember, but in the London office, we had badge readers at our space, right? So people that weren't on the team couldn't enter our space, like you would have at DeepMind or some of the most advanced technology units, but usually not for a creative team. But part of that was to protect the work, right? We would only ever present the work to the ultimate decision makers, right? So the processes you usually have, if an agency would do something for Google, right, they present it, if you're the marketing manager, they'll present it to you, you give your feedback, then you go together to your boss, you present it, you give your feedback, and like 5 revisions later, it lands at some ultimate decision maker, and it might still be good, but most likely it has lost an edge or is a lot less interesting because 5 very different people have given their feedback, and mostly with a lens of safety, right? So what will my boss think if I propose this? And nobody in this chain in between usually has the authority to make bold decisions, which you need for great creative, right? I mean, you can't create great creative by consensus. So the rebrand I'm doing at iPoint right now, same thing, right? I mean, I pick 2 decision makers or stakeholders, which is my CEO, of course, and my chief product officer, right? And those 2 are the only people who are involved. Not even the marketing team, frankly. I'm doing it. I did it myself because they're busy. I don't want to distract them, right? And I'm trying to get to something that has a very strong point of view and that does feel, as we used to say at Google, feel uncomfortably exciting, right? And you can't do that if you're consensus driven.
It's interesting because a recurring theme on this podcast is the idea of incentives. The incentives are behind everything. And what you mentioned kind of highlights that again to me that if you are presenting to the marketing team member and then the lead and then the director and you sort of go up the chain, the incentive for them is generally going to be, rightly or wrongly, it's just going to be like, am I going to look good to my manager if I share this with them? Which isn't the incentive that necessarily brings out the best work. And so kind of what you're doing at Creative Lab was designing the incentives to be better aligned with what's going to drive not necessarily the safest work, but the most creative and unique work that we can possibly do.
Totally. And I think, the results are stunning. It is probably the most awarded team in the world. Not that awards are the only thing that matter, but it's kind of an external validation. Yeah, but it's credit to Google's leadership to allow for a place like that to exist, which is more like a satellite, right? With some gravitational pull towards the center. So there's a shared DNA and values and so forth, but also distance, right? There's freedom in a team, which is sometimes, especially as organizations grow, hard to find.
Yeah. So when you're thinking through going back to the creative process, I'm trying to crack into this brain of how do you think about creative? When you're thinking through the work that you're doing right now and brand redesign for iPoint, where do you start?
I mean, I can happily. We literally, I think when you'll air this podcast, it hopefully will be live and people can go look at it. I think it's pretty radical compared to what we had, and pretty radical for a 20-year-old brand, but or 20-year-old company, German, hidden champion. But let me start by saying it's a means to an end, right? Having a cool brand is not a. It's not a. I mean, you could argue that as a marketing leader, there might be that you somehow incentivize to do that, so you have something to show for, right? Which is very tangible, but that is not my motivation at all. I want this brand to work, right? And everything I do is rooted in pretty clear strategic objectives, right? That I need this brand to fulfill. Ultimately, brand is the most a cost-effective way to attract and retain customers, right? It gives you an opportunity to kind of up level the conversation, right? It gives you an opportunity to, you want to kind of establish a preference with customers, right? I mean, there's this kind of old saying that 95% of the market are not actively looking for your products, right? But when they have a need, you want them to already know about you and ideally have a bit of a preference, right? And that's the same in our case. So the reason why the economic times are not easy for anyone right now. So even more than usual, there's pressure to be responsible in the use of resources, and I think in all industries, but especially also in ours. So I've been very clear on why I think we need to invest in our brand, right? And I think the truth in our case is we are fighting for attention in a market where everyone claims to solve sustainability and compliance issues, right? You go literally to our competitors' websites and they say the same things, right? They all look, I mean, from a visual identity standpoint, they're all green and blue, because they lean into this existing heuristics, and there's an argument to be made why you would want to do that. So people have a mental framework like, oh, it's green and blue, so clearly it's something in the sustainability space, but it's also not very interesting and not very distinguishable, right? You scroll your LinkedIn feed, how do you know what you're looking at, right? So in our case, I think, of course, if you just rely on performance marketing, you face a pretty predictable challenge of rising customer acquisition cost and inevitable commoditization, right? So when buyers can't differentiate between your solutions, they default to price comparison, to feature checklists, deals become transactions rather than strategic, right? And we see this already. We often find ourselves in procurement processes along competitors, and who, from a look at the website, might seem that they do similar things to us, and only after a lot of conversations and explaining do prospective clients understand the depth of expertise that we have, and how our approach is so much different. But the truth is, you've probably seen these Gartner flow charts on buying journey. Most of the time, you are selected or deselected without anyone speaking to any of your sales representatives nowadays, right? There's most of this buyer journey happens. And by the way, this is people always are kind of anchoring on the difference between B2B and B2C. This is kind of the same for us, right? I mean, you don't go into a store and without knowing anything and say like, "Hey, which TV should I buy?" Right? You do your research online, and then you go there with a pretty strong opinion, and most likely you walk out with what you had intended to, right? Or you actually don't buy it there and buy it online afterwards. You just want to look at it, whatever. But you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, that's a really good illustration. Basically, like, brand is important because you don't walk into the store to buy a TV, you walk in to buy a Samsung TV. And then when you buy that, if there's some advertisement for like a Sharp TV, it's going to have to be really good in the store to convince me to switch from what I was already planning to get. On the other hand, if you do the work on brand outside the doors of the store or before the sales process, it's much easier because that's where I'm actually making the decision. So it's almost like marketing can be where the decision is made, whereas sales or sort of the down funnel marketing is almost past the decision point for a lot of consumers or businesses.
100%. I think if you do this well, a strong B2B brand changes the fundamental economics of customer acquisition, right? You create buyer preference before the sales process even begins. You enable premium pricing because you establish a clear differentiation, right? And you attract inbound interest from qualified prospects who already understand the value that you bring, right? So I think brands work because you show up distinctively, just differentiated, but distinctively again and again until you own space in people's mind, right? So this is, I think I call this mental availability, which is really the currency of brand building, right? The likelihood that your brand comes to mind when someone has a problem to solve, right?
What B2B brands do you think do this best today, if any come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think the let's put it this way, the golden discipline of brand building is kind of category creation, right? If you're actually able to create a category, and a lot of companies have succeeded at that. We're not even aware anymore that these categories didn't exist, right? I mean, take CRM. If you say CRM, people think of Salesforce, right? But they coined this term, right? It didn't exist before, and that worked out really well for them. And you have that in, I mean, there's so many examples of this, like Figma, right? Collaborative design, right? Or I don't know, Gong is a great example, revenue intelligence, right? I mean, they record sales calls. It's a great tool, don't get me wrong, but and most marketing and sales leaders I know use Gong, although without necessarily any clear and are not necessarily able to explain how it is so much better than competitors, but they've done a great job of elevating a tool that records sales calls into a revenue intelligence, which is a whole new kind of category, right? And other people like, what HubSpot has done around inbound marketing, or DeepL, German company, around like this idea of language AI and so forth. So I think these are great brands.
That's such a good point on category creation. I remember reading a book, I'm forgetting the name, but this is like 15 years ago. That was talking about basic marketing strategies. And one that they made the point of was everyone knows the first person to fly around the world, but no one knows who's the second person. But maybe the first person to fly around the world on a single engine plane, now a few people know. Or the first person to fly around the world on a paraglider, now a few people would know. So defining a new category, you stand out. Just being the number two, number three, you don't necessarily stand out at all.
100%. And I think there's any one of your listeners who's interested in this. There's a couple of books around this as well. One is called Play Bigger, which is and I think one of the classics around that kind of walks through that. And yeah, look, at the end of the day, I think often in business what we see is those who define the playing field win, or dominate the market, at least, right? So when you let others define the category, you're forced to play by their rules. You compete on their terms, you measure success by their metrics, right? And if you rewrite those rules, if you create a new playing field, you have a chance to define the metrics of success there, right? And in similar ways, I mean, one of the golden examples in the consumer space is what Apple has done with the Shot on iPhone campaign is one example, right? Where they completely changed the conversation. It used to be, Samsung and all these others are advertising the megapixels of their cameras, and then Apple comes along and they just have huge billboards with beautiful pictures, and it just says Shot on iPhone. And it says a couple of things. You look at it, right? And you're like, if I can take that picture on an iPhone, that's probably good enough. I don't care how many megapixels or lenses or whatever it has, right? But they've also been really targeted. I think there's another aspect to it. I think you were in London at the time as well, where in Shoreditch or in the Tube, you would have one set of pictures in this campaign, and like in other areas of the city, you would have other pictures, right? Like in the airports, it would be very travel focused and landscapes, and then in East London, it would be more like cool people with the silly hats, and you didn't understand it, but you could tell they're creative. It also shows you the person, the photographer or the person that's taking that picture, that has that kind of lifestyle, where they have those kind of friends or go to those kind of places, would not consider ever having any other phone in the pocket than an iPhone, right? So by having an iPhone, you create an association to that. So that's why that's been a brilliant campaign. But it has also, created its own set of rules on how to look at camera phones.
And that's an interesting point when it comes to branding. So billboards, out of home campaigns like in the Tube in London are one way to do it. For a B2B company where you're not targeting a massive set of consumers, but you're really targeting a specific group of decision makers within certain companies, what channels do you use to do branding?
Well, first of all, everything is kind of branding, right? Unless you're like, I mean, the companies, I assume, listen to this, right? Of course, if you're like a Fortune 500 company, you have an entire brand department and dedicated budgets for big campaigns and so forth, and you do those airport advertisements. But I think even earlier on, it's important to understand that everything builds your brand, right? And most, especially as marketeers, sometimes we're so caught in our ivory tower, right? The conversations, whether it's at Capital G or now at iPoint, I had with our employees, and which is so important to bring them on this journey, right? Because as a CMO of a VC, you can do whatever you want. If the interaction of a founder with the investment partner is terrible, right? Either they're late or they're rude, or, it takes, even with the administrative business partner, right? If it takes like 4 weeks to schedule a meeting or they're not respond, like that creates the brand. You can do whatever you want on the marketing side. You can write the most beautiful LinkedIn posts. It doesn't matter, right? And we know this from our own experience as consumers as well, right? So the rubber hits the road in those touch points. And same for us now, right? If you, whether in a sales conversation, how is your follow up? In a VC, a big part for us was like, how do we say no? Google had this always on interviewing, right? Where like in these interview trainings, they always told you like, listen, we have more than 1 million people a year applying for jobs at Google, and we make less than 0.5% gets an offer letter from us, right? So that's a lot of people walking around the world talking about the experience interviewing at Google, which has not ended in a positive result, right? So how do we make sure that the experience and the process has been professional and pleasant enough that they still walk away with a positive impression of the company and talk about the company in positive terms?
Which then means that this internal communication of who we are, kind of like you mentioned at the beginning of this is who iPoint is, becomes really important for all employees, not just marketing employees, but all employees who are public facing, and really all employees who do anything, because the work is always going to be public facing to some degree.
100%.
How do you
And
think about
this is, sorry, but this is your job as a marketing leader, right? You can't do a rebrand and being like, well, the brand deck is ready, but no one's using it. People still make their own slides, or people are not sticking to our narrative. They speak about our company in the wrong way, right? And I think what helps is bringing them on the journey from the beginning. So the first thing I did on our brand journey in both cases, or every case when I've done a rebrand, is just talk to people, one to one in a small place like Capital G. I had everyone pitch to me. Like, imagine I'm a startup founder. Give me your pitch. What do you say? Right. And surprise, surprise, it sounded like, 30 different companies, because some people spoke about the Google VC. Some people spoke about like a private equity like investment, a growth fund, and so forth. I'm like, okay, in your pitch, we all have to start with the same line, right? We Alphabet's independent growth fund. We just have to land that. And afterwards, there's a bit more liberty about what you say, right? But this is the same here at iPoint, where I spoke to over 60 people in different sessions, asked them, why are you here? Why did you join in the first place? Why are you still here? Not like, what do you think a brand should be, but just understanding their motivations on why do they show up to work every day, right? And I think, so every time I go back at an all hands, and we do this for every milestone, I'm like, okay, we used to have a mission and a vision and a purpose, and it's all super complicated. No one understands which is which. Now we have one purpose. This is our purpose, and this is why this is our purpose. It's based on what you told us, what you think our purpose is, and what motivates you, right? But it's better articulated. Here's our brand idea. It's not our line. It's not our, or it doesn't have to be our line, but this is kind of the lens through we look at everything we do. And they find themselves in those because they've been involved from the beginning. And then to answer your initial question on how to bring that to the world, I think in a B2B context, LinkedIn is your is your place to be in most cases, right?
fair, fair? And I love that point you made of asking employees, why are you here? It struck me that asking the right question is so important. If you ask the employees, like, what's the company's mission? They'll say the thing that they think they're supposed to say or that they heard sometime. But if you ask them, why are you here? You get to that deeper motivation of like, oh, I want to help make the world better by improving our climate. And that is the real human mission that connects equally as well with your external stakeholders as it does with your internal stakeholders. This is the motivation. That's an exciting way to break through and really get the correct answer to what is the driving factor beyond the words and the platitudes.
And not just
I want to
making this
talk.
last comment on this, not to make this all about Google, right? But I think to this day, it is mind blowing that even at, I don't even know, 200,000 employees, you can stop anyone in the corridors at Google and ask them, what's our mission? And they can tell you it's to, organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. Like, that's a good mission. Like that doesn't happen in any other company. Nobody knows their mission, right? And that's why we've invested quite heavily into kind of, um, invested in terms of time and kind of thoughtfulness into crafting a purpose. You know, there's a standard slide, there's a mission, vision, purpose kind of values that companies use, and then founders go and fill that in and they break their mind. What's the difference between a mission and a vision? I don't really know. And, it's too complicated. Leave it, right? Have one purpose statement. And in our case, we landed on we exist to put power in the hands of people who are dedicated to advancing a safer, more sustainable future. That is understandable. People can repeat that, right? And I see that without me forcing it when our product leaders present their work. This is their first slide in product presentations, right? Because they anchor their work in that mission, in that purpose that we have, why we're here.
Yes. Yes. Okay, I want to pivot to a slightly different area,
Go.
which is building teams. So you have advised a lot of startups when you're at Capital G. You had a team at Google before that, and you've had many teams since then. How do you decide what roles you need on your team, what seats should be on the bus to be the most successful team in whatever goal you have as a marketing lead?
Great question. You'll have to stop me because I'm super passionate about this topic and I can talk about it for hours. So I'll throw a bunch of stuff at you and then you just pick on whatever you think is most interesting and we can deep dive on it, right? And I think there's the strategic view of, as a leader of a team, how do you assemble a team? And then there's the kind of more generic, how do you hire great people and retain them? So maybe to start on the first, I think, and this is no a controversial point of view, but I think how to particularly build a marketing team has changed, right? So especially now with the advent of AI and agents and so forth, I'm not quite there yet, but I want to get to a place where I kind of have a hybrid team, right? A human and a non-human team, because I think in order for us to really leverage the power of agents and the potential, we have to take them as seriously as we would take our normal employees, right? So I'm already running interviews for agents, right? So far, I haven't hired one because we're not good enough yet at building them, right? But I've talked to friends and colleagues who have do it in a similar fashion, right? So they create a job description and then they create different agents. They try to fulfill their need. And in a B2B context could be as simple as someone who does prospecting, right? Or someone who you have target accounts you want to get into, and there's a lot of research you need to do on mapping the buying center, understanding kind of the financial metrics of the company, like all this kind of stuff can work through agents, right? And once you hire them, you should give them a name, and they should be on your Slack channel or whatever it is you use, and they should be part of the team, right? And I think the preferred marketing org structure, I think in most modern context or most modern companies, should be a relatively small in-house full-time team of probably generalists, marketeers, right? Ideally product marketeers with some different edges. Maybe one person is, in our case, product marketing is actually quite tough because technically it's so complex what we do, right? Maybe someone has a communication edge. Maybe someone has an edge in CRM or similar things. But I think you want to have pretty strong generalists who can make a broad set of things happen. And then you bring in expertise. And that expertise might be a brand strategist you use for a rebrand project. It might be a PR agency, SEO agency, whatever. And that allows you to be quite flexible. But I think the days where CMOs measure their success by the size of their headcount are long over.
How do you think about the balance of the agility of having agencies or freelancers working with your team with the protection of your brand, that you want these people to actually understand your brand and be able to represent it in all of the work that's being done?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, I'm being very careful on who I choose to work with. And I think my preference is usually either I try to hire at a certain seniority, and by keeping the in-house team small, I'm able to pay, a pretty fair day rate to someone who has like your or my level of experience. And there might be other use cases if you do consumer marketing and you need to manage, I don't know, an influencer marketing program, and you might need someone who's TikTok native and is 20 years old and super successful. I don't know. But in most of my contexts, right, if I hire a communication professional, I want someone who has an existing black book of journalist contacts and so forth, right? If I hire a performance marketing manager, I want someone who's had a couple of repetition and not someone who was a Google account manager for 2 years and then, now is freelancing. So At least for us, that's not my preference. So yeah, I think if it's agencies, I try to go for very boutique ones, right? Because I want to get the most value for money. I don't want to get pressed into an existing framework. Like most large agencies to scale have a framework how they operate, right? They're like, yeah, we send you a questionnaire, then this, and to a degree that's fine, right? But I kind of want someone who, and not everyone wants to work like that, which is fair, right? People have different approaches, but I try to be very clear about what my expectations are, which is like, I want a sparring partner on eye level. I want someone who helps co-create the brief with me, right? I have a view of what is my problem and what I might need and what the brief is. But then I want someone who can come in, who I can share this with and where I have the trust to share very openly data and, insights and give them access to all our accounts and the stuff, and who then helps me shape the brief, and then we just execute it, as simple as that.
How do you find these people? Because it's one thing to know you want to hire the super experienced person who already has this black book of all the right journalists to contact, but how do you find them?
Usually through recommendations, to be honest. Most of the time, it's not the people that you see every day in your LinkedIn feed. Sometimes, but there seems to be kind of a function of, the people who are doing the best work are usually too busy to do that or don't really have the need to create a lot of inbound demand. Yeah, so I think and you might say, okay, I don't have a network. Everyone has a network, right? If you work in a startup, you most likely have an investor, right? Ask your investor, look what other portfolio companies are doing. Does another portfolio company from your investor have a website that you love and you need to rework your website? Well, get your investor to introduce you to the person who relaunched that website, right? I mean, even if you don't know that person directly, you have to then put in the work to get a connection. And then to your question of brand safety, I usually right now I do all the onboarding of people we work with, of course, with the person on my team, but I do take a personal responsibility for that as well, right? That we're off to the races in the right way and that we set a clear structure how we want to work. And then, I stay in the loop as much as needed. And when I feel it's going in the right direction, I move on to the next problem to solve.
I love that. It is a very real challenge, I think, for someone who's not already deep in the network to find these companies or find these agencies. But to your point, you just start by doing, and before you know it, you have a network. Start with the network you have, and before you know it, you've built it much, much further.
I'm not sure, to be honest, I'm not sure I buy it, because I think first of all, these things change all the time. Just because I had a great performance marketing manager I worked with 3 years ago doesn't mean that person is still the best person. So whether it's in the B2B context, there's things like the Exit 5 community, or like there's all these places you can go. Most people, I mean, I'm like in 10 WhatsApp groups from like kind of founders, startups, and not most of them are not that useful, right? But I think everyone knows someone, right? Who you can ask. And frankly, even people you don't know, right? If someone would write me on LinkedIn and after we've done the rebrand and be like, hey, just saw your rebrand, amazing work. I love this. Who did you work with? Like, I'll help them. I'll introduce them. Makes me look good. Why wouldn't I? Like doesn't cost me anything to send a quick introduction email. So you have to do the work, right? And understand what you want. But yeah. And if you want, we can also talk about the how to find like marketeers.
Let's do. I wanted to talk about developing early stage marketeers, which fits really well with how to find them. How do you find and how do you develop the sort of generalist marketers who you want to be within the core team that's representing your brand and everything?
So, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. That is my absolute preference, to have a mainly young and inexperienced team necessarily, right? So I think I have a person on my team who's a high performer who used to be a working student, like just joined the company 2 years ago. And it's puts a lot of effort and pressure on me because you need to help this person start by learning how to work, right? How do I structure my work? And especially in a kind of a hybrid or remote environment, right? I mean, if I have one recommendation for people early in their careers, like don't accept a remote job, right? Go into an office and sit next to people who know what they're doing and just observe, right? I think if you're early in your career, it's very hard to be in a remote or hybrid environment because you miss out on all the things you learn between the meetings. It's the classic, right? One thing is what happened in the meeting, but then it's like what happens what's discussed afterwards, or the quick debrief with a more senior person on the corridor, right? Or even getting into meetings you wouldn't be invited to. I mean, the best meetings I've learned the most from were like because someone saw me and was like, "Hey, do you want to join this? I think this could be interesting for you." And I would have never been in there, but I just happened to sit in front of the meeting room, and someone was like, "Ah, this could be good for Thomas," you know? So yeah, I think like this is pretty general people management stuff, right? But I think you have capacity, you have capabilities, and you have attitude, you know, and there's different ways of framing that. Google had their 4 dimensions of GCA, cognitive, general cognitive ability. How smart is someone? I'd say that's capacity, right? Role related knowledge, that's probably capabilities. And then they had leadership and googliness, or whatever that means. But I think capacity and attitude are probably the most important things, right? You need to have a certain base level of smartness, right? Because especially if you're early in your career and you join my team, and because in the most humble way possible, I also tell the juniors on my team, or when I interview people, I'm like, look, I'll invest a lot of time into you. And this, I think, is one of the opportunities here, because if we were at Google, there were like 3, 4, 5 layers between you and me, and we would speak, maybe once a year at the Christmas party, right? Or in a monthly, I don't know, team meeting, or I don't know what it is. And here we speak every day, right? But that means, because that is an opportunity for you to kind of hit the accelerator, and it's kind of a learning microwave, because you have a chance to really grow very, very quickly. But of course, you need to find someone who has a capacity to do that and isn't immediately overwhelmed, right? And so I think that's why capacity is super important, just like a level of smartness. And then attitude, I think an attitude can make up for a lot of things. Someone who just wants to do a good job and who is motivated, is most like that takes you very far, right? And then capabilities, of course, there's certain areas where, you know, the product marketing manager I have is incredibly senior, and it's incredibly helpful that he is, because just having the conversations with the product managers and managing the politics and all this stuff, like a junior would break, right? That, like, so certain roles need that level of experience and a bit of gravitas and just like life experience, But I think in most roles in marketing, that's why I then have the expert freelancers, right? I'm like, okay, go work with that LinkedIn agency and, ask every question you have. I mean, we literally pay these people to help you, right? But assume that a year from now, we don't have that agency anymore, and you need to cover that job. So figure out what they do, how they do it, and learn it.
Quite exciting. What do you find are the like 2 or 3 things that are most essential in the first 6 months of someone who's joined your company as a young employee, their early 20s? What are the few things that you can do that set them on a more successful trajectory versus if you don't do it, they're more likely to fail?
Very good question. I mean, onboarding is everything, right? And again, that's also something where traditionally in a German Mittelstand company, then hasn't been something that's been invested in as much as it should have. Let's put it that way, right? I mean, I remember when I joined, I was kind of assumed, like, maybe naively, being used to the Google context and so forth, like a little box arrives, and then, with my swag, and then, I open my inbox, and it has like, okay, here's the onboarding agenda, right? And that didn't necessarily happen. So after like a day, I was like, oh, hello. So anyhow, that's long in the past. So now people who join us have an incredible experience. But I think you have to be super structured and super hands-on. We're always afraid of micromanaging, but in the beginning you have to micromanage, because you wanna fight, like you wanna keep riding the wave, like being just on this edge of the person being overwhelmed and and breaking, but not crossing that line, right? So in order to understand that, okay, is it too much? Is it too fast? Do we need to take a step back? Or is it not enough? Is that person getting bored in the second week already? And twisting their thumbs with nothing to do? Okay, how can we accelerate it? So I think, and being quite structured around that, there's obviously the understanding of products and knowledge, meeting the right people, and as quickly as you can, just doing something, how small it might be. But I think, because that immediately creates some kind of success, right? And then letting that person get the flowers presented at a team meeting, shared as an all hands, whatever it is, right?
How do you think about managing the board or like the managers of the managers? How do you represent marketing in that circle?
Very good question. I'm incredibly lucky. Our investor is amazing. They're called Grow Capital. This is not a secret. It's on the website. They're a Danish fund, and they're great people, very smart, but kind of very human, which is in the private equity world not always the case. So we've done a lot of co-investments with very big, who shall not be named, but very famous big private equity companies in the US. And as a marketer, I'm getting screwed here. I just don't know how, right? You kind of walk into every meeting with a knife under your table. I'm like, I'm sure they're going to ask for a metric I don't have, or like whatever, right? Because these are people, these are calculators on legs, right? Usually not very high EQ, insane IQ, but they're not here to make me feel good or about myself or help me in any way, right? They just want to get through the list and pressure test whether the model they have in their spreadsheet actually where it breaks in real life. So that's not the case at iPoint, which really helps, because marketing is not painting by numbers, right? I mean, it should be measurable and you should have metrics and, you should find ways to measure things. But if you only do the things you can immediately measure, you're not going to do great marketing either, right? So there needs to be a little bit of that balance. So, and like we discussed in the beginning with a CEO or with leadership, I'll try to do the same with the board, right? First of all, I'm being 100% honest and transparent with them. And my CEO backs me to do that, which should be a given, but is not always a given, right? So my first slide in the first board meeting ever, 2 weeks after I joined, said, marketing is not set up for success. And I've been pretty clear on, I was like, listen, it's only been 2 weeks. I might be wrong, in some areas I'm probably going to be wrong. But based on what I've seen, here's what I think where we lack certain capabilities. I mean, you have to kind of also adapt to the language, right? So I literally had a table. I'm like, this is the marketing, this is the user journey, this is the marketing stack, this is why this matters. And then traffic lights, red, yellow, green, and then here's the next step, And then 3 months later, I came back to the board meeting and I had a second column with traffic lights, and some of the stuff that was red was now orange or green, and some of the stuff was gray because I said, listen, this is a problem, but it's not the highest priority. We're going to deal with that later, So you have to handhold them and manage them because it's naive to expect them to understand what you do. I mean, that's literally why they hired you, right? Because you're the expert.
I've never worked with boards or done something to that level, but something that what you said triggered for me is it's sometimes very tempting as a marketer to say, oh, I don't think this is very important. This like stakeholder management, I don't want to spend time on it. This isn't the real thing. I want to go do the real thing, which is like running the campaign. But actually taking the time to do the management really, really well versus doing it good enough can be a huge differentiator. That if you do it really, really well, now you're earning the place at the table. You're earning the trust of your stakeholders. They say, okay, Thomas is telling me honestly that they're not set for success. So I'm going to pay attention to what he says in the future. Versus if you just do good enough and you have a decent slide, it's good enough, it's quick, it's done, and you can go back to the so-called real thing. You're going to have to handle more questions down the line. It's just going to be a harder relationship. Spending the time to do 150% initially is often so much more valuable than doing 80% and doing 80% again tomorrow and the next day and the day after that because they ask you more questions.
Well, if you have a good board, these are the smartest people you've ever met, right? And that's not always the case, but I'd say in our case, we have an amazing board. I have so much respect for every single person there. They're all smarter than me. They have an insane experience. Our chairman of the board is incredible. Operator himself coaches other chairmen of boards for our investor. So the guy is a legend, right? So of course I have every amount of imposter syndrome and whatever, you can imagine when I walk into that room. Of course, it is very tempting to be like, this is a super high pressure environment. Let me just tell them what I think they want to hear. So they leave me alone and then I go and try to do my thing, right? But that is a recipe for disaster, right? Because the best thing you can do, of course, ideally, everything is great. You have numbers to prove that everything is great. And you just walk into the board meeting. You're like, listen, here are the deals that are touched or sourced by marketing. Here's the ones we accelerated. This is our pipeline for the next quarter. And here's our whatever KPIs we define to measure our brand. And everything is great. And you get a round of applause, which never happens in a board meeting, right? There's no applause. And then you leave. But most likely that's not going to be your reality. So the second best thing to delivering what they want to hear is give them the confidence that you have understood the problem, you're taking it seriously, and that you have a plan. right? And because for them, it is like, there's problems everywhere. There's problems on the product side, there's problems on the business side, there's problem on the marketing side. And they have high capacity, but they also at some point it's really helpful to them to know that the marketing problems are under control, right? And of course, you need to tell them what you're going to do, what are the next steps. You need to give them a timeline. You need to say, like, listen, right now, this is not working. I'm aware of it. I have a plan how to fix it. It will require 3 months. So don't ask me next week if it's fixed, because it won't, right? But at the next board meeting, or at the board meeting at the end of the year, whatever your timeline is, I'm going to come back to you and this is going to be fixed. And until then, you don't need to ask me about it, right? And then, of course, ideally, you do manage to fix it. You have to measure yourself, right?
Important part of the important step
Exactly.
in the situation.
And sometimes you won't be able to get it done, right? I mean, I always try to under promise and over deliver, right? But sometimes you won't get it done, but then you should have good reasons why, and you can learn something. But if they don't trust in you, and if they don't feel that I mean, it's a privilege to have that seat at the table, right? Not all marketeers do. In most companies, the marketing guy reports to the chief business officer and is not invited to the board meetings, or is invited to present half a slide on whatever and doesn't stay for the rest of the board meeting, has no context, right? The fact that I'm there and I have a seat at the table is a privilege, and that means I have to kind of step up and deliver that and take that seriously.
When you look at these people like CEO, investors, board members, they all have value to add, but they're also very busy with a whole bunch of different things that are not marketing. How should a CMO think about what asks they bring to each of these people that they can actually contribute before they get context switched into some other project?
I think, and this is where it's a brilliant question, because this is where a lot of marketeer and marketing leaders fail. I feel we claim to be the people in the organization that understand people. Like, no, we understand the customers. We do the user research. We do the customer success stories. We do like, and then often we fail at understanding our internal stakeholders, right? And this is something, again, I learned at Capital G and in Creative Lab and at Google, right? I mean, I spent an absurd amount of time thinking about what is top of mind for my CEO and what is top of mind for my board, and not just up, also to the side, to my chief product officer. What keeps him up at night? What are his struggles right now? What are and how can I help? And how does what I do fit into that and contribute to it? Same with my chief revenue officer, who's, frankly, don't tell my CEO, but probably the most important stakeholder I have, right? Because we have to work hand in hand. So, and it starts from, one is like kind of the business side and understanding what topics are current and top of mind for them. But there's also a human side, right? If I know there's an investor meeting on a Wednesday, I'm not going to bother my CEO with with some brand question on a Tuesday, unless I think it helps him, right? I actively go to his administrative business partner and say, like, hey, I have my one-to-one this afternoon. I see in his calendar, or I know he has an investor meeting on Wednesday. If he needs the time, I'm happy to move to Thursday. Like these kind of things. I really try to actively manage that, because, and then as it relates to my team, I think there's a saying as a manager, you're either a shit funnel or shit umbrella. So if I don't install this confidence and answer these questions, then they come to my team, right? If he doesn't get what he needs from me, he goes directly to my team. And if there's one thing I can do to help my team be productive, is to give clear direction and then shield them from everything else. Let them work, right? It is literally my job to manage our stakeholders. So that's why I'm quite invested in doing that as well as I can.
And the scary thing with that last part is it's so easy to funnel the things down to your team and not even realize that you're doing this all wrong, because there's not necessarily a feedback loop that tells you, like, hey, by the way, you're losing a lot of productivity because you're funneling all this stuff to the team. You have to be proactive and like doing a 360 review, taking the time to get people's input. Otherwise, it's so easy to make these mistakes and not even realize it.
And take responsibility. You want to be a leader? Okay, that's what it means, right? I'm a big yogi. I'm not that good at meditation, so I never managed to. I find it very difficult, but I am a big believer in it. And one thing that really stuck from me from the first times I kind of try to engage with that is this idea that changing how we react to the world is often as good as changing the world, right? So it is very easy for me to be like, guys, I'm just out of the board meeting and it was a disaster. Like, we don't have enough pipeline and everyone is losing their mind and there's so much pressure and they're probably going to fire me and whatever. So what can we do to drive pipeline? But if I go like, so team, had the board meeting yesterday, wasn't great, but don't worry, we will be fine. I explained why we are where we are right now. I explained what we're doing. They're happy with the plan. There were some thoughtful comments that I'm going to get into that actually I think are good nuances and help us focus what we do. I suggest we clearly do have a gap. So let's talk about, what I mean? Like just by even just how I debrief that, and like all of a sudden it just becomes, because fear is paralyzing, right? And there's often, and so that's why it's so important, I think, to just, you have this is what I get the money for, right? I mean, because the job itself is fun, frankly, like I would do this even if I didn't get paid for it. But what is not fun is like being that suspender, that emotional suspender, right? That because I get paid to lie there at night, at 3 a.m. and think about how the hell I'm going to save a pipeline problem, right? This shouldn't be my team's worry.
Yes. Yes. Okay, that brings us to the end of the interview. But before we close off, I have a lightning round. I'll throw out some quick this or that questions. Feel free to talk in length or very briefly about each one. First one, B2B.
At the moment, B2B. And the reason is, I think consumer products are very exciting. And there was a time, as you know, where everyone wanted to be B2C because you can, do these big TV ads that you can tell your mother about and everyone can be proud, whatever. But I think as a marketeer who likes to work in structured way, apply playbooks and, have a proven and repeatable playbook in order to create value, that is a lot easier at the moment in B2B than it is in B2C, I think.
That storytelling or direct response?
I'd say storytelling.
Perfectionism or speed to market?
Speed to market, 100%.
Voice of the customer or voice of the brand?
Always voice of the customer.
Marketing-led company culture or product-led company culture?
Very good question. I'd say product-led.
Interesting. Well, thank you for coming on the show. That brings us to the end. Where can people go to learn more about you?
Frankly, as I mentioned, the busy operators, there's no Thomas Palm website or so forth. Just, everything you need to know, you find on my LinkedIn, and then just get in touch if you'd like to chat. I'm always happy to make time.
Fantastic. All of that will be in the show notes below. Thomas, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
Same for me. Appreciate you having me. Thank you so much.